Before we begin, a quick warning. Tennessee True Crime contains detailed descriptions and images of real-life violence. Some listeners and viewers may find the material deeply disturbing. This content is intended for mature audiences only. And remember, the goal of sharing these stories is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor the victims, understand the truth, and give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Listener discretion is advised.
There are some stories that begin with a murder. And then there are stories that begin with a death that nobody thought was a murder. Until another person died. Until investigators went back. Until they start asking questions about the first body. Until they realize that sometimes the strangest thing about a death isn't what happened at the end, but what happened before it. Let's go to July 9th, 1992 in Knox County, Tennessee. A 44-year-old elected district attorney general named Ed Dossett is dying of cancer. He's sick, he's weak, he's taking morphine for pain. And on this particular afternoon, according to the account given at the time, Ed is out on his farm feeding cattle. Then something goes terribly wrong. The cattle surge. Ed is knocked down, and according to the original explanation of his death, the animals just trample right over him. Now, by the time emergency personnel arrive, Ed Dossett is dead. His wife, Raynella, is there. She performs CPR. An ambulance takes him to the hospital, but he cannot be saved. And what initially appears to be a tragic farm accident is eventually recorded as exactly that, an agricultural accident. Case closed. Or so everyone thought. This is the story of Raynella Dossett Leith. They say the South never forgets. And Tennessee, she remembers everything. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime, where the shadows of the volunteer state's past meet the stories that refuse to be forgotten. I'm your host, Tiffany Morgan. Each week, we dig into twisted tales of betrayal, violence, and mystery. The ones where whispers carry truth, and the answers are never as simple as they seem. Let's step into the dark and piece together the clues. Because in Tennessee, some secrets still haunt the hills. This is Tennessee True Crime.
Down through the smoky hollers where the cold wind sighs, footsteps fall where the moonlight hides, whispers over rivers, a secret lost in time. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime.
So before we get into the questions surrounding Ed's death, we need to understand who Ed Dossett was and who the woman standing beside him was. Raynella Bernardine Large was born in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee in 1948. She would eventually become a nurse, and her professional accomplishments were considerable. She studied nursing at East Tennessee State University and later earned a master's degree in nursing. She became a respected hospital nursing administrator and was recognized as Tennessee Nurses Association Nurse of the Year in 1976. Ed and Raynella met while they were both students at East Tennessee State University. Raynella, of course, was studying nursing, and Ed intended to become a lawyer. They married in 1970. Ed eventually attended the University of Tennessee Law School and built a career in criminal justice. In 1982, he was elected Knox County District Attorney General. He was re-elected in 1990. Now, by all appearances, this is a very prominent East Tennessee couple. A successful prosecutor, a well-respected nurse, a family, a farm, a life that from the outside looked established and secure. Then came 1991. Ed was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and the illness changed everything. His body was deteriorating. He was experiencing significant pain, and morphine became part of his treatment. And that detail would become extraordinarily important years later. On July 9th, 1992, it was approximately 3:30 in the afternoon when an emergency call came from the Dossett farm. According to the account given at the time, Ed and Raynella had been feeding cattle when the herd surged. Ed was knocked down, the cattle trampled him, the injuries were real, his breastbone and his ribs were fractured, his lungs had hemorrhaged. There were injuries consistent with being struck by cattle, and there was reportedly even a hoof print on the chest area of his overalls. And at the time, those findings appeared to tell a fairly straightforward story. A terminally ill man had gone into a cattle pasture. He was weak, he was knocked down, the animals trampled him. A terrible accident. But there was a problem, and it was something that the investigators didn't fully understand at the time, and that was toxicology. So the toxicology report wasn't available when the original medical examiner made the determination that Ed's death was an agricultural accident. You see, the report arrived weeks after his burial. And years later, when the case was revisited, the toxicology result would become one of the most important pieces of evidence that prosecutors had. Because Ed's morphine level was extremely high. Dr. Darinka Malushnik-Polchin, who later reviewed the case, concluded that the concentration was more than twice the expected therapeutic level and questioned whether someone in that condition could have even been walking around, much less feeding cattle. So that changed the question. It wasn't simply, how did the cattle kill Ed Dossett? It became, could Ed Dossett even have been standing in that pasture when the cattle supposedly trampled him? Then comes the morphine question. The prosecution theory years later would be chilling. They suggested that Ed may have been so heavily drugged that he could not have been walking normally. Could someone in that condition have been knocked down by cattle? Absolutely. Could a terminal cancer patient taking morphine become severely impaired? Absolutely. But prosecutors eventually argue something much more sinister. That Ed may have been deliberately overdosed with morphine and then placed in the circumstances that would make his death appear accidental. That was never proven in court, and that distinction matters because the original medical examiner had accepted that agricultural accident explanation. There was no second autopsy establishing murder, and Ed's body was ultimately not exhumed. In fact, prosecutors made multiple attempts to obtain permission to exhume his remains years later, and they failed. In December 2008, Judge Richard Baumgartner rejected the prosecutor's third request, concluding that they had not provided sufficient enough evidence or arguments to justify his disinterment. So, the body that might have answered some of those questions remained underground. Fast forward to 6 months later. Something happened that would become one of the most talked about aspects of this entire story. So, approximately 6 months after Ed's death, Raynella got married again. Her new husband was David Leith. And David wasn't a stranger. He had been Ed Dossett's lifelong friend. The two men had known one another since childhood. David was a barber, and he and Raynella eventually lived on Ed Dossett's farm. Now, at the time, there was nothing illegal about moving forward with your life after the death of your spouse, but years later, prosecutors would point to the timing as part of a larger picture. 2 husbands, 1 woman, and eventually 2 investigations.
Welcome to Town Talk with Raven and Rob.
Behind the mic, I am Chad Graves.
Hey, Hitchcock.
This is Tennessee True Crime.
Get our toes a-tapping with a song. Makes me want to go down Texas way.
All right, we need to dive into some Main Street Journal news, though, Rob.
Well, let's dive right in. A Florida man.
I think Jerry Lee Lewis was the one that he was late for his own concert.
Was it because of the driver?
I think it was because of what he had in the bottle in his room, probably.
Now, 3 years after Ed Dossett had died, Raynella's life took another disturbing turn. And this time, there's a living witness, and his name is Steve Walker. Now, Steve is a man that had been married to a lady named Kay Clift Walker, and Kay had worked in Ed Dossett's law office. And in 1995, Steve Walker learned something devastating during his divorce proceedings from Kay. The child he believed was his actually belonged to Ed Dossett. Now, suddenly, the widow of Ed Dossett knew there was another woman who had been involved with her husband, and Raynella became angry. I'm talking very angry. But what happened next is disputed. There is no dispute that Raynella ended up facing an attempted murder charge. It's just how it came about, because according to Raynella's version, Steve had been behaving erratically near Ed's grave. She told police that she fired warning shots into the ground to make him leave. Now, Steve Walker has a dramatically different story. You see, he said that Raynella picked him up from his workplace and drove him to the farm. He believed that they were going there to talk. After all, his wife had wronged him and Raynella's husband had wronged her. But instead, according to Steve Walker, Raynella pulled out a revolver, and he said she just begins firing. Walker ran, he fell, and he said Raynella pointed the gun at him and said, "I can still shoot you." And then she pulled the trigger. But there were no bullets left. So Steve Walker survives, and Raynella was arrested and charged with attempted murder. She ultimately pleaded guilty to a reduced assault charge. She received 6 years of supervision and no jail time, and the record was later expunged. Her defense lawyers would later explain that as a strategic decision, taking that plea. But to investigators who would eventually look at the death of her husband, this incident would become something else. Context. Because now there's evidence that Raynella had at least once been accused of using a gun against someone with whom she was angry. And the person at the center of that anger was a man connected to the revelation that Ed Dossett had fathered his wife's child. Why is Raynella mad at him? So it ends up that there's two sides of Raynella. And this is where the story becomes complicated, as if it wasn't already complicated. Because Raynella is not some stereotypical villain. She was a nurse. She was a mother, a professional, a woman who had been married to a terminally ill man, a woman who had lost a husband, and later a woman who would insist that she had loved David. But her defenders saw something very different from the prosecution. They saw a woman whose life had been turned upside down by tragedy, a woman who had become the target of suspicion because unusual deaths happen around her. But prosecutors saw a pattern, and eventually that pattern would become the centerpiece of a murder investigation. So the first major break came after someone else died. And suddenly that old toxicology report looked very different. Again, Ed's morphine level, the fact that he had terminal cancer, the fact that his death had occurred in a cattle pasture, the fact that the original toxicology wasn't available when the first medical examiner ruled the death accidental, the fact that his injuries might not have been sufficient to explain his death, and the fact that Raynella was the only person known to have been with him. Prosecutors began arguing that Ed may have been murdered. They theorized that morphine could have been used to incapacitate him, and that his death might have been staged as an accident. Raynella very well could have administered morphine and then taken him out to feed the cattle and intentionally gotten him trampled. That is not out of the realm of possibility. Now, again, this is prosecution theory, but Raynella, of course, denied killing him. And the state never would obtain a conviction against her for Ed's death. But soon, investigators would have something that they didn't have in 1992, and that's hindsight. They would be able to look at Ed's death through the lens of another. Now, suddenly, there were two deaths that seemed to speak to one another. One involved drugs, and the other involved a gun. Both occurred in private surroundings. Both left questions about the woman who was closest to the victims, because soon came March 13th, 2003, 11 years after Ed's death. Unbeknownst to David Leith, his time was about to be up. And this time, the death would not be dismissed as an accident. This time, she calls 911, and this time, police would walk into a bedroom, and this time, a reported suicide would change everything. Because if David Leith had simply killed himself, like Raynella is reporting, then somebody has some questions to answer. Because this scene was telling a very different story to first responders and investigators. So let's go to March 13th, 2003. They're still in Knox County, Tennessee. A woman calls 911. Her voice is very frantic. She's crying. She's asking for help. And then she says the words that will become one of the most important pieces of evidence in one of Tennessee's strangest murder cases. My husband shot himself. Take a listen.
County 911.
Help me! Help me!
Ma'am, where are you?
Please help me!
Ma'am, what's going on? Ma'am.
My husband shot himself. Hurry!
Okay, where is your husband?
Hurry! He's in the bed. Please hurry!
Okay, ma'am, calm down. Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, I need you to calm down so I can get some help to you, okay? Ma'am.
Now, when deputies arrive, Raynella was laying face down in the front yard. She appeared extremely distraught. One deputy testified that her behavior appeared genuine. He described her as overcome with grief. And inside, the house was dark. The bedroom was especially dark. And there they found David. He was lying on his side. There was a pillow beneath his head, and the sheets and blankets were tucked around him. A revolver was near his hand, and nearby was what appeared to be evidence that David had been eating in the bed. A TV tray, a bowl, oatmeal. It looked domestic, almost peaceful, except for the blood. And one more detail. You see, at first glance, it does look like a suicide. But then investigators begin looking closer, and they discover something that makes the suicide theory increasingly difficult to accept. There wasn't one or two, but 3 shots from the revolver. And investigators begin asking why. And what was going on with Raynella? Because the prosecution would later argue that her behavior was part of an attempt to make a murder look like a suicide, and the defense would say it's simply the behavior of a woman who had discovered her husband dead. And that question, was Raynella acting, would follow her for years. Let's talk about the gun. It was a Colt 38 police special revolver, a 6-shot revolver. Investigators opened the cylinder carefully, and inside were 3 spent cartridges, 3 live rounds. That means that 3 shots had been fired. Not 1, not 2, but 3. And the bullet paths began to tell a story. One bullet struck the headboard. Another struck David in the forehead, and another went into the mattress.
Beer
beer from Belgium, bourbon from Kentucky, tequila from Jalisco, wine from Napa, Tuscany, Argentina, all of it right here in McMinnville, Tennessee. Worldwide Liquors carries thousands of selections from across the globe, so whether you're keeping it simple or going all out, you'll find exactly what you need. Whiskey, rum, vodka, wine, craft beer, hard seltzers, we stock it all. No matter the occasion, no matter the taste, Worldwide Liquors has something for everyone. Stop in and see us. Worldwide Liquors on 1717 South of Chancery Street, McMinnville, because life's too short to settle for whatever's just on the shelf.
So the investigators do what investigators do. They start collecting evidence, and they recovered bullet fragments from the bed frame and underneath the bed. Detective Perry Moyers was among the investigators who began questioning whether this is really a suicide. He noticed the blood spatter. He noticed the bullet in the headboard. He noticed the mattress. He noticed that the gun didn't have the kind of blood or tissue evidence that he expected from a close contact gunshot. And he began looking at the scene a little differently. David had been shot above the left eyebrow, and the wound wasn't a contact wound. And according to the medical examiner, there was stippling around the wound, indicating that the muzzle had been approximately a foot away. And now things aren't making sense. Because suicides involving a gunshot to the head are frequently contact or near contact wounds, but David's wasn't. The bullet entered his skull, it traveled through the brain, and it severed his brain stem. The medical examiner testified that the injury would have killed him essentially instantly. And once the brain stem was severed, David could not voluntarily move anymore. He couldn't consciously pull a trigger. He was dead. This is where prosecutors developed their central theory. They believed that the first shot missed. That bullet struck the headboard. They believed David was still alive. Perhaps he raised himself up, and then came the second shot. That bullet struck him in the forehead. David died immediately, and then came the third shot, but the third shot didn't strike David. It went into the mattress instead. Now, prosecutors argue that third shot was fired after David was already dead. Why? Because they believe someone was attempting to create the appearance that David fired the weapon himself, and that brings us to the gunshot residue. It is worth noting that gunshot residue was found on David's hands. Now, that initially sounds like evidence of suicide, but investigators found something more interesting. There was no gunshot residue on Raynella's hands. And that was a major problem for the prosecution, because if Raynella had fired the gun, where was the residue? Well, the prosecution's answer was essentially she may have washed it away, or she may have avoided leaving residue. Maybe she was wearing gloves or bags over her hands and she got rid of them. But the absence of that residue was something that the defense would repeatedly emphasize. The National Registry of Exonerations noted that no gunshot residue was found on Raynella and that no other physical evidence directly connected her to David's death. And this is where, as usual, the case begins to split into two different stories. According to prosecutors, Raynella killed David. She fired the first shot and missed, fired the second shot and killed him, and then she fired the third shot into the mattress. And then, prosecutors argued, she put the gun in David's hand and called 911. The theory was that the third shot was intended to make the scene look like a suicide, but there's a major question, and I really don't understand that either. But could David have fired the third shot after he was already dead? The prosecution says no. But the defense says possibly. And that scientific disagreement became one of the defining battles of the trial. Now, bloodstain pattern analysis became another major piece of the prosecution's case. Investigators found round drops of blood on the wall behind the headboard. Now, prosecutors argued that the blood pattern indicated David's head was elevated when the fatal shot was fired. In other words, he wasn't simply laying there where investigators found him. The prosecution's theory was that David, again, raised himself up after the first shot, probably trying to see what was going on. And then Raynella fired the fatal second shot and he fell backwards. And then, of course, that blood spatter remains on the wall. As prosecutor Steve Crump later explained the theory, blood doesn't turn corners. The physical evidence, according to the prosecution, required David to have been in a different position at the time of the fatal shot. But the defense had an answer, and it was surprisingly simple. They argued that David absolutely could have fired all 3 shots himself. Raynella's attorney argued suicide. They pointed to David's health, his depression, his mother's terminal illness, his medications, his emotional state. They argued that multiple shot suicides, while unusual, are not impossible. And they challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the physical evidence. One of the most dramatic arguments involved the gun itself. The defense demonstrated how David could have fired the first shot and missed, and then repositioned himself and fired the second shot. And that's fine. I can see that happening. You know, maybe you get scared, rightfully so, and you miss. But this third shot, they're proposing that involuntary muscle movement or a post-mortem spasm could account for the third shot. So after he's dead, his body is just spasming and he fires the third shot into the mattress. Now, the prosecution called that theory implausible, but the defense didn't need to prove that Raynella was innocent. All they need to do is prove reasonable doubt. Or create reasonable doubt, I should say. Now, there was another unusual aspect of David's death, and that is a toxicology report. Here we go again. David's blood contained Demerol, Sinequan, and Phenergan. David did not have prescriptions for any of those. Now, the medical examiner testified that the combination was highly sedating and that David would have been significantly impaired. She also believed the drugs were significant enough that David could not have gotten out of bed and gone about his normal morning activities. And prosecutors used that information to support the idea that David had been incapacitated before he was killed. But there was a problem. The state couldn't establish that Raynella had administered those drugs. There was no evidence presented that the medications had been found in her home. There was no direct evidence showing how David got them. There were no needle marks, and that uncertainty would become important. Now, the timeline on the morning of March 13th would become critical because Raynella said that she had been out of the house. She said that she had been visiting David's mother in the hospital, and she had an explanation for her whereabouts. But investigators discovered that David apparently had not followed his normal routine. A neighbor expected to meet David around noon, and David was normally a very punctual person. He never called off plans, but he wasn't there. Then there was Raynella's phone call to David's daughter, Cynthia. Just before 10 a.m., Raynella called Cynthia at work. It was unusual. Cynthia actually testified that Raynella had never called her at work before. Raynella asked, "Have you seen David? Has he stopped by?" She mentioned that David hadn't eaten his oatmeal, the one that was on the TV tray on the bed with him. And she said, "I'm at the hospital visiting his mom." And then Cynthia, David's daughter, remembered something else. She said Raynella sounded very cheerful, almost too cheerful. And then later that day, everything changed, and David, her dad, was dead. Then investigators began looking at money and inheritance. David and Raynella had executed wills. Their estate planning history was complicated. In 1993, after their marriage, David had a will that left the property to Raynella and his daughter. But in 1996, David executed a new will. And guess what it did? It left everything to Raynella, and it gave his mother a life estate in certain property. But his daughter, Cynthia, received nothing under the new will. And there was more. In 1999, 3 quitclaim deeds changed ownership of the property. The deeds placed property into joint ownership and right of survivorship, and that meant if David died, Raynella would receive the property covered by those deeds. Now, the attorney who prepared David's will testified that David had visited his office in February of 2003. David was reportedly pretty agitated about the 1996 will. He spoke privately with the attorney, but he did not change it, and then David died. And the original 1996 will couldn't be found. Only a copy remained. So Cynthia, David's daughter, challenged Raynella's right to inherit, and Raynella then accused Cynthia of killing David. Cynthia, of course, denied that. She said that nobody other than you, Raynella, has ever accused me of killing my dad. And that civil dispute added another layer to an already bizarre criminal investigation, because now add in questions about money and property and wills and inheritance and motive. But the prosecution still faced the same problem. Where was the smoking gun connecting Raynella to the gun? There wasn't one. No fingerprint, no DNA, no gunshot residue, no eyewitness, no confession. The case was circumstantial, and prosecutors knew it.
In a place like Warren County, community means everything. And when it comes to your health, trust goes a long way. Every prescription, vaccine, and interaction is handled with care, combining modern technology with a personal approach so you feel confident in every medication you take. And now with our Test and Treat program, you can get tested and treated for common illnesses like flu and strep right here without the wait. And whether it's inside the pharmacy or the drive-thru, the care you receive is more than a pill or a vaccine. It's those in the community serving the community. It's knowing that the staff behind the counter care about your health and your medication, but most importantly, you. So come to Graves Family Pharmacy, because here we put the care in Warren County's healthcare. Graves Family Pharmacy, caring for Warren County one patient at a time.
So David had died in March of 2003, and Raynella wasn't indicted for his murder until November of 2006. 3 years had passed. And by then, investigators were also revisiting Ed Dossett's death. The 2 cases had become connected. One husband had died under mysterious circumstances, and another husband had died under mysterious circumstances. And Raynella was at the center of both. Then came the most dramatic escalation yet, just when you think things can't get any crazier. In 2008, Raynella was indicted for first-degree murder in Ed Dossett's death. Now, for a woman who had once been viewed as a respected nurse and the widow of a prominent prosecutor, the transformation was staggering, because she's now accused of killing both her husbands. And the press began giving her a nickname, the Black Widow. But Raynella insisted that she was innocent, and eventually she would have her day in court. Actually, she would have 3 of them. You see, the first jury couldn't agree. The second jury convicted her. And then the story takes another turn. Maybe the strangest turn in Tennessee judicial history, because the judge who presided over her conviction was himself facing a devastating scandal. And that would eventually bring Raynella out of prison. But before we get to that, let's go back to the courtroom, because the state believed it had enough evidence to prove that Raynella had murdered David. And in January 2010, a jury was going to decide whether they believed them. After years of suspicion, the state finally secured that conviction, and prosecutors had that other charge waiting for Ed, the first husband. The man whose death had originally been ruled an agricultural accident, but almost immediately after Raynella's conviction for David's murder, the prosecution dismissed the charge involving Ed. The state would not get a second trial, not then, not ever. And then the case begins to unravel. The judge who presided over Raynella's trial was Richard Baumgartner. Now, Baumgartner had a reputation as a tough and experienced criminal judge, but behind the scenes, there was a serious problem. You see, good old Tricky Ricky was a pillhead. He had a drug addiction. He was addicted to prescription painkillers. And evidence later surfaced that his drug use had affected his ability to function as a judge. Now, according to the National Registry of Exonerations again, during the period surrounding Raynella's second trial, Baumgartner was receiving large quantities of OxyContin while also buying street pills. This is one of the most insane trials. I don't even know. Now, eventually, Baumgartner would leave the bench. He would plead guilty himself to misconduct-related charges, and then the question became, could Raynella possibly have received a fair trial under a judge whose own judgment had been compromised? Her attorney said, no, absolutely not. So they challenged the conviction. They raised numerous issues like evidence or lack thereof, jury instructions, how the forensic evidence was handled, the admission of estate documents, and claims concerning undisclosed evidence, and the conduct and impairment of a trial judge. So in 2013, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction on the issues presented in that trial, but the legal battle continued. Because we know how this works. It keeps going. Her new attorneys pursued post-conviction relief, and they brought forward information that they argued could have changed the outcome. One significant issue involved David's medical condition. Defense attorneys pointed to medical records that they said had not been presented at the original trial. And those records indicated that David had been experiencing cognitive and emotional problems. There were references to worsening memory and mood changes and frustration, and the defense argued that these records supported their theory that David may have taken his own life. And then there was another bombshell. A former sheriff's deputy named Steve Robinson reportedly told a defense investigator that he had seen an officer carrying the gun from the house before the crime scene technicians had ever documented the scene. Robinson later repeated the account and signed the affidavit, but then he recanted. Never mind. I don't know what I was talking about, but that didn't happen. Now, that made the evidence extraordinarily complicated, because if his original account were true, it potentially challenged the prosecution's presentation of how the gun was found. And if his recantation was true, then the defense evidence was far less significant. And now the question wasn't simply what happened in the bedroom, it was what happened during the investigation. So in May 2016, senior judge Paul Summers eventually granted Raynella a new trial. The reason? Well, Richard Baumgartner's impairment. Summers concluded that the justice system had failed Raynella because the judge overseeing her trial had been compromised by drug addiction. After approximately 6 years in prison, Raynella was released pending a new trial. Think about that. She had gone from suspect to defendant to convicted murderer to prisoner serving life to a woman walking around free awaiting a third trial. And prosecutors were not giving up. In May 2017, Raynella was 68 years old. She had already been tried twice. One trial ended with a hung jury, the second ended with a murder conviction, and now she's going before a third court. And the prosecutor is Steve Crump. Now, he believed Raynella had killed David, and he also believed that she had killed Ed. But that third trial was going to focus on David. So the state, again, reconstructed the bedroom. the bullets, the gun, the blood spatter, the medications, the alleged staging. The prosecution argued that Raynella fired that fatal shot and then attempted to create the appearance of suicide. Now, imagine this. You're sitting in court listening to this trial, and all of a sudden, the actual blood-stained bed gets wheeled into the courtroom. The defense used it to demonstrate its theory, and attorney Josh Hedrick climbed onto the bed. And a forensic expert demonstrated how David could have fired the shots himself. What a display. But the prosecution had a problem, because the judge wasn't convinced that they had proved who killed David. So, senior judge Paul Summers just concluded that the evidence might support the conclusion that David had been murdered, but it's not enough, so we're stopping right here. You have to prove that Raynella is the murderer, and this is where the case is falling apart. There's no gunshot residue. Her clothing did not establish that she shot the gun. The state couldn't establish an exact time of death, and Raynella had a good old alibi. So the jury is preparing to deliberate, but they never got the chance because this judge just said evidence is insufficient. She's acquitted. Not because the judge necessarily believed that David had killed himself or not, but they just say that, there's nothing to prove that she did this, so we're just done. This is a circus. The whole thing is a circus. But then came something fascinating because CBS interviewed some of the jurors that had been on the panel, and they said if we would have been allowed to deliberate, we certainly felt like we had enough and we were going to find her guilty. So we're left with some strange legal paradox where the judge says there's not enough evidence to send it to the jury. I'm just going to acquit. And then several jurors are saying, no, we would have convicted her. And the law ultimately sides with the judge. So Raynella walked out of the courtroom a free woman. Now, did Raynella Leith kill her husbands? We don't know. And that's an uncomfortable truth to live with. There's one final chapter to Raynella's story. On April 4th, 2026, Raynella Dossett Leith died at the age of 77 in Knox County, Tennessee. She died never having been convicted of murdering either of her husbands in a final judgment. And with her death, some questions died with her. Because the person who could potentially have answered what happened inside that bedroom and what happened in that cattle pasture was Raynella herself, the Black Widow. As we close another episode, I want to thank you for spending your time with us and for being part of the Tennessee True Crime community. This episode of Tennessee True Crime was written and hosted by me, Tiffany Morgan, and produced by the fabulous and patient Christian Weeder with Main Street Media. Our theme song is provided by John T. Productions. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to follow us on Facebook at Tennessee True Crime or Instagram at TN True Crime. You can also catch our show on Spotify or your favorite streaming platform. Your support, shares, comments, and messages help us continue telling these stories and reaching new listeners. I also want to say a personal thank you to the families, the friends, and the community members who reach out asking me to cover cases involving your loved ones. It is a responsibility that I never take lightly. I am continually humbled by the trust people place in me to help tell these stories, preserve the memories, and keep victims from being forgotten. The purpose of Tennessee True Crime has never been self-recognition or personal attention. This podcast exists for the true crime community, for victims, for survivors, and for the families whose lives have been forever changed by crime. My goal is to tell these stories with respect, compassion, and a commitment to truth. I also hope these cases serve as reminders that awareness matters. Sometimes the warning signs are subtle. Sometimes the changes in behavior, the unhealthy relationships, the addiction, the manipulation, or the dangerous influences around us can be easy to overlook until it's too late. If these stories encourage even one person to pay closer attention, to trust their instincts, to check in on a loved one who may be struggling, or to recognize red flags that may otherwise go unnoticed, then they have served a purpose beyond simply recounting what happened. And if you're listening today and find yourself heading down a path surrounded by people who encourage poor decisions, criminal behavior, addiction, or violence, I hope these stories serve as a reminder that every choice has consequences. One bad decision can change lives forever, not only your own, but the lives of innocent people around you. Finally, Tennessee True Crime is currently seeking sponsors and partners to help keep the show funded, growing, and available to listeners. If you or your business are interested in supporting the podcast, please reach out through our social media channels. Join me next week as we uncover another Tennessee case that has left a lasting mark. Because here in Tennessee, we never stop telling the stories that matter, and some secrets we refuse to let stay buried. Until then, trust your gut, pay attention, and take care of each other. Tune in next time on Tennessee True Crime.
Down through the smoky hollers where the cold wind sighs, footsteps fall where the moonlight hides, whispers over rivers, a secret lost in time. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime. Dark tales in the mountains where the mist won't lie, echoes of the fallen under starless skies. Hear the hush of memory, the voice of the unsaid. This is Tennessee True